Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's the 23rd of April, 2013, and Jim Popham is our special guest. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Steve.
So glad to have you here. The Future of Education is a Web 2.0 Labs project. This busy slide details the worldwide virtual events that we hold that are free for educators and are based on educators helping teach each other. We had the School Leadership Summit in March. All of those recordings are up at schoolleadershipsummit.com. If you're going to ISTE, the Large Educational Technology Show, we have a shadow program, a series of events that take place kind of on the fringes of ISTE called ISTE Unplugged that start with an all-day unconference called Hack Education. Coming up in July is our worldwide STEM Plus or STEM X conference, and then the Future of Libraries conference for the third year in the fall, and then, of course, the 5-day, 24-hour-day Global Education Conference in November. More information at web20labs.com. Coming up on this interview series on Thursday night, Andreas Schleicher from the OECD is going to talk to us about what we can learn from international data. John Hunter comes back to talk about his book, World Peace and Other Fourth Grade Achievements. Peter Gray on Free to Learn. More there you'll see. Matt Hearn on deschooling was rescheduled. Matt had written down the wrong time and felt terribly apologetic, but we'll get him back on the show. If you've missed any of the shows, they are all recorded in full Blackboard form and an MP3. Vivian Stewart and Pasi Solberg talked to us about Finland, international benchmarking, and the use of those international tests for thinking about improving education. Elliot Washer and Charles Wojcicki talked to us about leaving to learn, school internships, getting students out of the school in order to improve their learning. Anyway, lots up there, hopefully something that will be of interest to you. Those of you who are in the studio audience now can let us know where you're participating from. Look for the star to the left of the map. You're going to click on that twice, and then you're going to click on the map. I was telling Jim I'm in Udaipur, India right now. I see Coach Carol's in the room, I think. Maybe. Oh, a different Carol. I spent a week with Coach Carol in Australia, which was delightful. But now looking at schools in India and learning quite a bit. Santa Cruz, Mexico, Tasmania, delightful. Illinois, Pennsylvania, Arkansas. Please feel free to keep posting those messages in the chat as we move forward. And sure glad to have you wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording. There is a Mighty Bell space for this show. Mighty Bell is a place for curating content. We use it to keep track of conversation after a show. So if you want to continue to discuss the ideas that you hear about in this interview, you can go to that Mighty Bell space that I've just posted in the chat. So Jim, this was really a fascinating opportunity for me to get to know your work. I've never been a teacher. I've been a parent who homeschooled children off and on. I grew up in a household that was academically oriented. My father was dean of admissions at Stanford and then at Princeton, so there's a history of high-stakes testing in my family. I learned so much about testing that maybe I should have known, but wasn't readily at my fingertips. Do people express appreciation to you for just being kind of clear about describing testing?
Well, sometimes they kind of genuflect before me, but ordinarily I just get. I ordinarily just get a yes. I enjoyed the book. I've got to tell you something, Steve. This is a kind of an intriguing development. I looked for the first time at the title that we have here, and it is The Truth About Testing. You apparently read a book I wrote called The Truth About Testing?
I read that, and I read Unlearned Lessons.
Well, so you've read something that was I didn't realize we were talking about, but I'm willing to. Actually, I thought we'd be talking about a new book that I just got, that I wrote a little over an hour ago. My first copy of a new book called Evaluating America's Teachers. And I thought that was going to be our focus, but that's fine. Could I tell you a story about one of the books, The Truth About Testing? It's a true story.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I didn't have access to the new book, so in my preparation I've read things that you've written. But the goal here is to have a conversation about what you care about.
Well, we certainly will deal with whatever you'd like and what I'd like to, but I've got to tell you about that, that first book. This is a book I wrote for ASCD, and it was the first book of, I think, 5 that I wrote for that publisher, that organization. And some books you write and you think they're okay, and some books you write and you really like them. And I like that book. I was trying to describe, and as you've probably seen from looking at the book, the fundamentals about testing that were important. And so I went down to a conference in San Diego that had been sponsored by ASCD, a huge conference, something like 1,400 people were attending, and I'd been invited to be the middle speaker between 3 speakers who were well known, and I was the middle speaker. And so I show up the first day, and no one knows who I am, and I wanted to listen to what people are talking about. I generally like to do that, and so I was listening in on the speeches. But then I went to the bookstore, and there in the bookstore, ASCD really hustles their books very hard. And so I went into the bookstore, and I saw a woman looking at that book that I had written, The Truth About Testing. I said, over her shoulder, I said, "Good book, you ought to buy a copy." I was not really focused exclusively on royalties there, but I just couldn't pass up the chance to say something good about it. So she didn't turn to me, but she said, "Do you know the author?" Well, this is one of those moments, Steve, that come to you occasionally in life, and you dare not pass them up. So I said, remember, I haven't spoken at the conference. She isn't looking to my name badge. She doesn't know who the devil I am. And so I said, "Know him? I've been sleeping with his wife for the last 20 years. And I did. It's a true story. And in all credit to her, she didn't turn or seem ruffled, but after a while she did look at me, saw my name badge, and figured it out. But there was a kind of a golden moment. Anyhow, I like that book.
You know, you're a good storyteller. I don't know how you came up with a line like that fast, but there was another story in the book where I remember I laughed out loud. I'll have to see if it comes back to me, but that's an enjoyable part of your writing.
Well, thank
you.
So
tell us about the new book, and let's try and weave the threads together.
Okay, and they certainly mesh. The new book is about teacher evaluation, and its full title is Evaluating America's Teachers, Mission Possible, ? And this is not an arena that you would be particularly interested in, but in America right now, we've had a tremendous upsurge of interest in teacher evaluation because of 2 federal initiatives. They're not laws, but they're initiatives where the federal government wants to reform schools, and one of the key components of that reform is to be the establishment of more rigorous teacher evaluation programs by states. So in 2009, and then again in 2011, 2 initiatives came out where, in order to get money or to get to be allowed to escape from some of the accountability requirements, states had to agree to come up with a rigorous teacher evaluation program, among which there were features such as you had to use student test scores as a, quote, significant factor, end quote, among multiple measures in judging the quality of teachers. Well, this is very different stuff, Steve. We've never had that kind of a requirement for teacher evaluation. And as a consequence, many educators across the nation, 40-odd states are dealing with this now, are soon going to be visited by teacher evaluation systems that are very demanding.
Well, this, of course, does mesh really well with at least the material that I read. It was very helpful to me to have an understanding of sort of how testing began, and I was not familiar with the Army Alpha and World War I. I guess I sort of had some passing knowledge. But do you want to describe kind of what happened there?
It's an important development, and I'm glad you spotted that, because it shows you are able to read with comprehension, Steve. You get A+ on reading so far, because that is truly a pivotal notion. It was in World War I, not World War II, World War I, that we found ourselves engaged in a conflict larger than any the U.S. had ever engaged in, and people in the Army, frankly, did not know how to identify lieutenants, second lieutenants who'd go over and lead the troops. And they'd had a really bad time of it in the early part of the war, so they went to the American Psychological Association, and the president was a guy named Robert Yerkes, and he appointed a committee. They went to Vineland Training School in Vineland, New Jersey, and in 7 days and 7 nights, they created the Army Alpha, and then they rested. And the Army Alpha was a group administrable intelligence test. It had items in it that were mental problems of one sort or another, quantitative, qualitative, verbal problems, and based on this you were able to rank examinees, that is, recruits, according to their relative ability. Someone would be ranked at the 96th percentile, that is in relationship to a group, the norm group who'd taken the test earlier, or someone at the 54th percentile. And the whole essence of that approach, Steve, was to spread people out in order that you could spot the very best ones. Well, it worked wonderfully well. In World War I, it was administered to about 1,750,000 recruits, and it really did the job beautifully. The people who performed very well were sent off to officer training programs. The people who scored lower were sent to the trenches to fight the war. It worked well. Now, what's fascinating is this is an aptitude test, purely, simply an aptitude test designed to spread people out to see who has the aptitude to do well in officer training programs. But after the war is over, after World War I is over, all of a sudden you discover that testing organizations in this country are producing achievement tests, not aptitude tests. These are tests designed to measure how much you know, what your skills are, what your knowledge happens to be. And as a consequence, that model was predicated on the same kind of comparative interpretation model that the Alpha had been devised for, and became so prevalent in this country. And since that time, the majority of educational testing in the United States of America has been focused on comparative interpretations, just like the Alpha.
So that was there were two phrases that you used that really were helpful to me. One was this fine-grained comparison idea, and the other was the score spread. You've touched on the comparison, and you mentioned score spread, but describe what score spread is and why that becomes so important in terms of understanding how these tests are created.
Again, that's a very sharp insight, because once you realize that the tests that we've been using in education since that era, it's almost 100 years now, once you realize that they have been rooted in the notion of comparative score interpretation, then you realize you have to do that efficiently. And since we test kids for, roughly an hour, maybe less, you have to have items that do a reasonable job in spreading out those test takers. Because if indeed the scores were too bunched up, then you could not make the fine-grained comparisons that are at the heart of Army Alpha testing. And so what indeed you must do is make sure that the items produce total test scores, where you have some high scores, some low scores, and lots of middle scores. You have to have score spread. No score spread, you can't have comparative interpretations. Now, here's where the plot thickens. In order to get score spread with a relative handful of items, maybe 40, 50 items, that's all. How do you do that? Well, you make darn sure that those items produce reasonable differences among the test takers. Well, what kinds of reasonable differences? One of the ways is to make sure that an item is linked to students' socioeconomic status. in other words, to make sure that the kids who come from an affluent background are more likely to answer it correctly than kids who come from a less affluent background. All the people who create these tests don't set out to stick it to the poor kids, but what they do is they have items in their tests that in fact are linked to socioeconomic status, and socioeconomic status is a nicely spread out variable. And as a consequence, you can be almost assured that if you have an SES-linked item in there, that indeed you will get score spread, and Army Alpha testing wins the day again. Now, the problem is when you have achievement tests employing SES-linked items, you get the score spread, it works like a charm, but it doesn't measure how well those children have been taught. What it measures is what they brought to school, not what they learned there.
So there's this socioeconomic status that ends up fulfilling the need for score spread. There's also, you discussed this inherited academic aptitude, which also can fulfill the need for score spread. But as you say, these are unrelated to the actual value of the instruction. So in this new federal initiative, is this sort of your same drum that you need to be banging here, which is if we don't understand assessment, this is going to drive all of the wrong policies?
Well, you're right. It's bongo time again for sure, and the reason is, and I'm glad you mentioned the intellectual aptitudes issue. I was trying to be succinct with my jabber, so you'd have your next question up and running. But the truth is, it's either items linked to SES, socioeconomic status, or items that are linked to inherited academic aptitude. I mean, quite clearly, kids are born with dissimilar smarts. It'd be easier for educators if they were all born with identical academic aptitudes. But when it comes to verbal smarts or quantitative smarts, they vary. I have 4 children. It was my Catholic period. And my daughter is remarkably good verbally, but not all that good when it comes to quantitative things. And the boys are very good quantitatively, not as good verbally. So kids differ. Now, if you can link an item in your test to kids' inherited academic aptitude, then you again get score spread. So academic aptitude, just like SES, produces score spread, but is not related to how well kids have been taught in school. Now, along comes teacher evaluation time, and the federal architects of this particular program say you must use student performance, test performance, and that must count as a significant factor. I think fully 10 states now are requiring that students' test performance count for at least 50%. 50% or more of the way you evaluate a teacher each year is supposed to come from students' test scores. Now, if the test, in fact, is one of these that contains many items linked to SES or to aptitude, those tests measure the students who wander through the door, not how well they're taught once they get inside that school. So the idea of using these kinds of tests to judge teachers is not only unsound, it's almost immoral. So all of these teacher evaluation programs popping up around the nation, if they use the wrong kinds of tests, Steve, they're going to come up with some terrible decisions about students.
There's two things that I would want to clarify here. The first is most of us believe that tests somehow reflect successful instruction. And part of what was so valuable to me was understanding that that's not really true, right?
Well, it's not necessarily true. You could build a test that was designed to measure how well kids were taught, but in the
and I
majority
want
of
to get to your own history and
right,
your own company that was doing this, because I think that's sort of a part of the story. I guess the second piece for me that I want to sort of focus on for a moment is the motivation of those creating the tests and using the tests for these purposes. You know, the idea that they're bringing in socioeconomic status questions and inherited academic aptitude is I don't think you believe this is a malicious attempt to create problems, but you're saying this, if I hear you right, you're saying this is just something they have to do in order to have the test provide the kind of data that they're being asked for?
You're exactly right. I guess the way to think of it is that the overriding conceptualization of educational testing in this nation has been guided by the kind of thinking that brought us the Army Alpha. Okay, so you got to get your head around that notion. What we're trying to do here is create tests that allow us to compare test takers. That's the mission. Now, to do that well, you must have score spread. And to get score spread, you don't set out malevolently to penalize the poor or the less able. What you try to do is to produce score spread. As it turns out, however, one of the most efficient ways to do that is to have items in the test that do not measure how well children have been taught. And that's how you get in this kind of a bind. So that's fundamentally what people have to recognize. Is it possible to create a test that indeed would be, we call it sensitive to instruction, would be instructionally sensitive? Yes, it would. But are the people who are creating those tests even aware of this? No, they've been trained in traditional psychometric, that's measurement talk for a ritzy way of saying how you build tests. They've been trained how to do this in an Army Alpha kind of way, and that's how they do it. It's the accepted practice. It's fine if you want to spread out examinees. It's fine if you want to compare test takers, and there's a role for that. You say your father was involved as an admission officer at Stanford. Well, if this is the case, there are moments when you do want to spread people out. You want to take the cream of the crop. You don't want to take everyone. That's fine, but it's not the way to judge the quality of schooling. And right now, thousands, if not millions, of teachers will be judged, their quality, based on tests not intended to serve that function, and they don't do it at all well.
This need for really understanding assessment, right? Our ability to understand it and to talk about it allows us to ask for, demand, discuss policy that relates to assessments and how they're used. But I also hear at least in the material that I wrote, that we really need to understand assessments because they can be a very powerful tool for helping students and teachers to assess how the learning is going.
You're exactly right, and that's one of the interesting developments of the last a decade or two, and that is an activity generally known these days as formative assessment. Now, formative assessment is really a process by which you use tests during the ongoing instructional enterprise to verify how well kids are doing, and teachers then make adjustments if the kids aren't doing sufficiently well. This may seem like common sense to you, but it's not done very often in this nation or elsewhere. And in 1998, two British researchers published a review of the use of classroom assessments to improve instructional quality. And in this particular review, they supplied convincing evidence that it really works, and works very well. And so one way you use tests cleverly to improve the caliber of kid learning is you use them as part of the formative assessment process. And that's a very effective way to do it. Another way is you set out clearly the targets that you think are appropriate. And those targets, if they're well described, can provide terribly useful destinations for instruction. I guess I'd reduce it to something as fundamental, Steve, as an ends-means paradigm. As human beings, we identify certain ends that we want to accomplish, and then we identify means that we will use to try to accomplish those ends. Now, obviously, if you're unclear about what the target is, you're not going to come up with means apt to be successful very often. And in much the same way, if you have tests that clarify in a way that people understand it, then educators and indeed students and students' parents will know where you're heading. Right now we are in the midst of an era in this country that will be dominated by something called the Common Core State Standards. Those are curricular aims that have been approved by something like 40-plus states. And those curricular aims, if they're well clarified, can prove remarkably useful in designing instruction and then using the formative assessment process along the way to change bad instruction to good.
At one
and so
point
on.
you talk about, when you're talking about the very clear nature of what formative assessment can do, that it's just that everybody should be doing it, and then you describe it like having a cure for the common cold, but people not actually taking it or implementing it. Why do you think that is, and why is there such a focus on the means rather than the ends?
Well, I've got to tell you, before we go on, this will be called en route assessment. I'm assessing the caliber of your questions, and they are simply first rate. I mean, you do seem to focus pretty hard on what's most important, and I guess that's why you've been doing this for more than a half an hour. Okay, the problem is you've got this powerful technique where there is research gratification saying, hey, you use this, teachers, and you're going to get good results. And you say to yourself, why on earth aren't people using it? How can this be? The fact is that when teachers are first educated in teacher education programs, and when they get out and learn from the people who are out in the field, what we tend to focus on is what we do with kids. We focus on the means employed in class. We focus on process. If you think about most accreditation associations, when they're judging the quality of schools to make sure they're good enough, they focus on what goes on in the classroom. Only recently have we seen some accreditation associations start to look at student results. That may seem astonishing to judge a school without looking at how well it teaches kids to do things, but that's in fact what we have done in this country. And so there's a kind of a whole culture of attention to process, not to consequence. In part, this is my guess, in part, I think one of the reasons we're so loath to look at consequence is it's threatening. If you set forth what you are going to hope to accomplish with kids and measure at the end of instruction whether or not you have, there's threat there. There is real threat. And as a consequence, it would be a lot easier just to focus on, oh, here's what I did, here's what I covered, here's the content I treated, and so on, the pages in the book that I covered, and not look at the consequences. So, in order to get teachers to embrace the formative assessment process, a process that works so well, what we need to do is make it attractive to them. Make it in the best interest of the teacher to use something that simultaneously turns out to be in the best interest of the child. And this is doable. This is doable particularly in this era when teacher evaluation is going to be so heavily dependent on students' test scores, and not just on students' test scores on statewide tests, but also on the students' performance on teacher-made tests. In other words, if greater learning can be promoted and measured, then teachers will look better, be evaluated more positively, and so this is a golden moment. This moment when we can make it in the best interest of the teacher
Jim,
to
what
do
are the
things that are in the
consequences
best
if we
interest of
don't
the students.
figure that out?
A continuation of less quality in our schools that we want. I think I have a good friend, David Berliner, who just published a piece earlier today and sent me a copy of it. And David claims, I think with some sound justification, that the crisis in American schools is overrated and indeed manufactured, and that we don't have to worry about China because they've got their own problems and so on. And what he's saying is that it's not as bad as all that. Well, even David, however, would say it can be made better. It can be made better. And those of us who are in education and we do not achieve what we could get from those kids, we do a terrible thing. I used to be a philosophy major as an undergraduate, and Aristotle said the greatest metaphysical evil was unactualized potency, which is unachieved potential. So you got a kid sitting in that classroom. This kid could be something pretty special, and the instruction the child receives does not allow that to blossom. We'll have more unblossomed potential unless we make it better. This is a very special time. We have these brand new curricular aims that are supposed to govern what happens in many states, the Common Core state standards, and we've also got a teacher evaluation program that is going to force many teachers to think hard about how they produce evidence of their own quality. These are special moments, and unless we take advantage of them, we'll have same old.
So, Jim, there might be a slight slowdown in your internet because all of us heard your voice speed up to catch up, and I spoke over you. I apologize for that. I thought you had finished the thought. I want to talk about what individual teachers can do, because I think you give some really valuable advice. But before doing so, I wonder if you might tell us what you tried to do or did with your testing company during the period of time that you were running it, and how you looked at credible evidence of instructional effectiveness.
Well, I guess, Steve, you'd first have to know that I never took any coursework in graduate school about testing. I had no interest in testing at all. Took a doctorate at Indiana University and never took a single course in measurement. I just wanted to teach prospective teachers how to teach children better. And then I discovered somewhere along the way that as the stakes associated with testing rose, that is, as we began to have tests which were used to award high school diplomas. If kids didn't achieve a certain level of proficiency, we didn't award them high school diplomas. All of a sudden, those tests became truly high-stakes tests. And with that, the tests began to influence dramatically the nature of instruction. Now, in 1963, fully 50 years ago this year, a man named Robert Glaser had introduced the notion of Criterion-Referenced Measurement, where in contrast to Army Alpha measurement, which he identified as norm-referenced measurement, because you reference the performance of a test taker back to that of a normative group, like the 43rd percentile. Now, Glaser said, when instruction is working well, and it could be, when it works well, you have a reduction of score spread. And with that reduction of score spread, you face a situation where traditional Army Alpha testing doesn't work because you don't have the kids spread out anymore. And so what he said we ought to do is we ought to focus on having tests that reference the performance of the test taker to a clearly defined class of skills or knowledge. And so what you did is you defined your skills very well, call it the criterion behavior. The kid took a test, and then you reference the kid's performance to that class of criterion behavior. You might say, for example, that of the 500 tough-to-spell words in our district spelling list, the child has mastered 79% of them. That would be a criterion reference interpretation rather than comparing it to other kids. Well, that being the case, those kinds of tests, criterion reference tests, could be used not only to guide instruction, but could be used more accurately to evaluate its quality, and so I started writing about it. And after writing about it for almost 10 years, I finally realized that no testing companies were going to do this kind of thing. And so I set out to establish a small testing company where we would produce criterion reference tests. And I had the experience of essentially moonlighting while I was at UCLA with a testing company. And we designed high-stakes tests for approximately a dozen states around the nation. And I learned a lot about testing.
You ended up having to close that business down fairly quickly, right?
Well, it wasn't all that quick, but it took a while. And then when we were bidding on projects, for example, State X wanted to have a new test of, let's say, 10th grade students or 8th grade students. And we would receive a request for proposals, and we would submit a bid. And because I was in Los Angeles, we had a staff of about 35. And they were bright, really smart people, and they could write well and they could think well, but I had to pay them pretty well. And as a consequence, when we put in a bid, it was a reasonable, middle-of-the-road bid, but the testing companies against which we were bidding came in bidding zero. That is, let's say our company put in a bid for $220,000. They came with a bid of zero, and the reason was they could afford to take on that test development project because if they got the contract, they had enough peripheral products like study guides or extra tests or textbooks or things of that sort. And so once they had their foot in the door, it was profitable for them to stay in. We didn't have any of those things. And after I think about 3 projects in a row where I went to the trouble of womping up a really first-rate proposal and then ending up losing to a do-it-for-free bidder,
the recounting of that story led me to really wonder about sort of systemically how you would fix something like that. And probably not coincidentally, talking to Pasi Sahlberg from Finland, would it be fair to say that there's some importance in separating out the research and policy decision-making on education from the financial interests?
Oh, I think it's a world greatly to be desired, but not a trivial undertaking. Many of the organizations now producing tests in America, some of which are controlled in Great Britain, Pearson, for example, they have enormous resources, and things are going pretty well for them right now because there's so much testing going on. So it's very tough to buck those outfits. Yes, it would be better.
So in the end of the Truth About Testing, which is now 12 years old, maybe, you have some action options. Are those a good way to look at how educators might address this federal initiative and the rigorous teacher evaluation based on student test scores? Is that advice that you would currently give?
Well, Steve, in the first place, I'm going to need you to remind me what advice I gave there. But in the second place, things that I write are almost eternal. And so once you regard the book as holy writ, then clearly they still work. But let me ask you.
Oh, that's fine. Well, the first several all revolve around understanding assessment and then helping to teach others. So it's I would guess that I don't think you put it in this order, but number one would be to use formative assessment well within your own classroom. The next would be to help others in your profession understand assessment, and then it's to help administrators or decision makers, it's to help parents, and it's to help legislators. So you sort of expand out into increasingly trying to have an impact on the understanding and dialogue around testing.
Well, I wish you could. You're in India now, but if you could go around I could ride you around in my pocket for a few days, you would discover that I'm still strumming that same guitar chord. Earlier today, for example, I work with two people. We're going to be making a presentation back in St. Louis in June. The focus of the presentation is assessment literacy, how to promote it. Later on in May, I'm going to be meeting with the National Assessment Governing Board and proposing to them specifically. The National Assessment Governing Board, which is the group that oversees the test we call NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress. I'm going to be encouraging the National Assessment Governing Board to take on a project to promote assessment literacy among citizens, parents of school-aged children, and students themselves. Now, let me explain the reason for this. If you were to ask me the following question, if I were Steve, and I said, Jim, tell me what you think is the reason we are in the bad shape we are currently in right now in American schools, I would respond to you this way, and politely, of course. Here, Steve, is the answer to your question. The reason I think we're in bad shape in American schools is that we have made a series of mistaken judgments, mistaken decisions based on our misunderstanding about educational assessment. We have allowed, for example, schools to be judged on the basis of their students' performance on tests ill-suited for that purpose. And we did that because we didn't know any better. Educators have allowed Army Alpha tests to be used in judging their quality. It is absurd. And so as a consequence, I really believe, Steve, that if we would have only made better decisions based on assessment results, we would have had a better educational system. Ergo, what you have to do is you have to promote more knowledge, not about the exotics of educational testing, but about the fundamental notions. And they're not all that many, 15, 20. If Americans understood those 15 or 20 potent notions of educational testing, we'd be in so much better shape. So, yes, I continue to believe that some form of understanding
at least in what I've read, you did a really nice job of saying, hey, we have some responsibility here for not having spoken up and figured this out. But you also kind of admit your own path and learning, and that you weren't really fully aware of this. Okay, I'm going to shift gears sort of slightly here and ask a question that I brought up before the interview you started, but I'm interested in how you personally kind of resolve the issue of the quality of instruction, assessment, and learning, and the things that are being learned. And I told you that I was visiting a school for children of a leprosy colony here in India, and that I could think of all of these ways in which the learning could be improved. But the things that they were learning were very removed from the practical realities of their lives. There's no information about agriculture or craftsmanship or trade skills. How do you reconcile improving a system and the actual end goals of the system?
If you have a powerful tool, you have to worry about the way it's used. if you create a scalpel, you can save lives or you can kill folks with it. The more potent a tool is, the more desperate it is that it be aimed in the right direction. And therefore, if schools are ineffectual, tests are stupid, no one is learning one thing or the other thing, who cares? But if we want a better situation, if we want good instruction, properly assessed instruction, then it's imperative we aim it at the right outcomes. Now, what happened with the emergence of the Common Core state standards was that there was evidence, in a substantial amount, that some of our states were pursuing curricular aims not sufficiently demanding. They were having kids learn stuff that wasn't as challenging as the kids should have been learning. And as a consequence of this, those children were being educationally shortchanged. So the Common Core state standards, fostered by some foundation money and a couple of organizations working pretty hard at it, came up with what they believed would be more demanding curricular targets, and those curricular targets would be appropriate for as many states who bought in, and all but a few states have indeed accepted the Common Core state standard. So what we see in this country is an attempt to have more challenging targets that are consonant with today's reality, not yesteryear's, and I think that's fundamentally the way you have to do it, Steve. You have to aim at powerful targets when indeed you have a powerful instructional system. And we need to work on both ends of it, but if we ever get a good, strong instructional system, to be aiming at paltry targets would be unprofessional.
There was a point in the book when you talk about the value of assessments for learning, both to the teachers and the students, and it reminded me of an interview I did recently with John Hattie on visible learning. What is your personal sense about the degree of agency students should have in terms of deciding what to study?
Well, it's interesting. I told you I got a copy of my book just an hour ago, the new book, and the first quote is from John Hattie. I will not read it to you aloud, but it really is good. Anyhow, John's a friend I've known for a number of years and one of our prominent leaders in the field of education. And he, as is the case with many people outside of the U.S., seem more attentive to the creation of an autonomous learner. That is a learner who is not the recipient, but is an active participant in the learning enterprise. A few moments ago, we were speaking about formative assessment. Well, I've written a couple of books on formative assessment, and in those books, based on the work of Black and William, I tried to define formative assessment as the use of en route assessment as instruction is taking place, and the results of that are used either by teachers to change their instruction or by learners to alter their learning tactics. That is, students figure out, based on the results of their own learning, whether or not they're proceeding properly. And you will discover, I've spent a lot of time in Europe, that our colleagues over there, when they think of formative assessment, whereas we in the U.S. bang at the teachers making adjustments, over there they tend to focus more on the role of formative assessment in helping students take command of their own endeavors. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, and if when you were speaking with John Hattie, he pushed that same point, I'd not be surprised. He's from down under, and he talks funny. So this
is the point at which we're going to shift into Q&A. I can keep asking questions if nobody in the audience has a question, but if you're in the audience and you have a question, you can post it in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. That's the third icon over in the participant box. It's a hand, and your hand will go up, and it will give you the microphone, and you can ask Jim a question. Jim, is there anything I haven't touched on, not having read the new book, that you would like to describe as a part of your thinking?
Oh, my general pleasantness as a person, I don't think you've been strong enough there, Steve. But beyond that, no, I think I compliment you for touching the important points in the books you have read. You must read the new book now
Porter wants
and
to
apply
make
the
sure she
same
knows the
rigor
name of
to
the
that
new
endeavor.
book.
Porter, it is called Evaluating America's Teachers, Mission Possible, ? And Corwin publishes it, and I just saw my first
Julie
copy.
wants to know who's developing the Common Core standards. Do you know a good answer to that? I should, but I don't.
Well, it's interesting. This is Jenny who asked that. Let me be candid with you, Jenny, since it's being recorded. There was a fair amount of mystery regarding who developed the Common Core State Standards. A very small group with relatively modest involvement from externals and almost no serious vetting of what they were coming up with. They created the Common Core State Standards. And they're pretty good. I don't question that. But I would have felt much more comfortable had they involved other content-competent associations offering their advice and so on. Not everyone would have agreed. In the final analysis, we'd come up with something, I think, better. And so during the time when they were actually being developed, I really tried to find out who's going on, who's behind all this stuff. And it was almost impossible to find out. Now, and I say that in one of the books I wrote recently. That was bothersome to me. It was a secret game. And yet, my compliments to them, because despite this, they got so many states to agree. And on balance, the Common Core State Standards, the curricular aims embodied in those content standards, are, I think, better than many states had in operation at the time. And so I give them all sorts of credit. Now, the question is not what the Common Core State Standards are. They're out there now. But there are two assessment consortia that have been set up, state assessment consortia, two groups, one the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and the other the Park Assessment Consortium. Roughly each of them have 20 to 25 states, and they're producing assessments to measure students' mastery of the Common Core. That's where the action is. You have curricular aims, and that's talk. You have measures, you have
Jim,
assessments,
Hetty
you
wants
have
to
tests,
know, how do you
reality.
think we can best get the information out there about those 15 or so things all teachers and parents should know about testing?
Hetty, I think what you do is you come up with a bat and you take as many swings at the ball as you can. And I have tried in so many ways to get assessment literacy promoted. Hell, I've written books for parents. I've written books for teachers, for administrators. I've written books for people who have recently died and have been interred. I am eager to get the message out there. And one of the things I'm doing in May is to talk to my colleagues in the National Assessment Governing Board, encouraging them or working with the federal government to promote assessment literacy in a meaningful manner. I think a lot of organizations need to let educators, parents, policymakers in particular understand about the fundamentals, not the exotic stuff, the fundamentals of educational measurement, and I think we need to do it on all sorts of fronts.
To learn something if somebody's trying to tell you, whereas when you become involved in the creation of something or are participating actively in a dialogue about it, it takes on new life. Have you seen ways in which schools or districts have involved parents and teachers and students in such a way as to sort of help them have ownership of this?
Steve, truly, I've not seen it meaningfully. I think you're right. I think it was there are different ploys that one would utilize when you're trying to get different constituencies involved, and you want to use all of them. But one of the things that drives me crazy, educational tests are so darned important to children these days. And yet we don't let kids know about these things. We let children think that these tests are infallible. I mean, here's an example. You've heard a lot of people talk about valid tests. Well, there is no such thing as a valid test. What's valid is the inference that you base on a test score. You get a test score, you look at that score, and you make an inference about what the kid knows. You can't see inside the kid's head, so you make an inference about what the kid knows based on that test score. And if that inference is accurate, then you have a valid inference, okay? It's not the test. And the reason that's so important is once you ascribe validity to the test itself, you say this is a valid test, then you assume that whatever that test produces is accurate. Not so. It's human beings who make judgments about validity. And
this is going to go off the deep end
about every
here,
half hour.
I wondered as I was reading your material about sort of our culture around schooling and how many of us, how many parents and teachers really think deeply about learning versus meeting requirements and the kind of ways in which school becomes almost a ritual. Is there a degree to which the system driving itself and people sort of on the outside not feeling like they're really impacted has led us to a place where we're not really thinking about learning that much?
I suspect you're right, and let's be candid. In many quarters, you will hear people talking about the importance of parental involvement in education in the schools. In many schools where I've been, Steve, the teachers and the administrators would be very happy to get the parents miles away. They don't want anything to do with them. It's not the case that, in fact, you have a number of schools that are desperate to have parents involved. And so
we always finish our shows on time as a courtesy to our guests. We have about 2 minutes left. There were more questions that have come in than I'm going to be able to ask, but I do want to ask Porter's final question. I'll ask two quickly. Marianne asks first, what do you think about the push by parents to have their children opt out of state assessments?
I think if the assessments are the wrong kinds of assessments, then a protest is warranted. I'm not sure if opting out is the right way to protest. I'd get on the legislatures, I'd get on the state departments of education and harangue them to come up with better tests. With better tests, opting out is a dumb notion.
And finally, Porter asks,
tests,
what have you seen in the world of testing and measurement recently that excites you?
The last time I saw you, Porter, it was a very exciting interchange, and I think that's probably about as close as I can come to it. Porter is a colleague. We run into each other at occasional meetings, and the truth is, what excites me is the possibility, always the possibility of understanding this stuff better and making better decisions. That potential.
Jim, this has been a delightful hour.
So
Thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's Jim Popham.
My pleasure, Steve. Good work.
Don't miss Thursday evening, Andreas Schleicher from the OECD on learning from international data. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Take care now, and bye-bye.
Bye.